Good morning and welcome to the National Adaptation Forum webinar series hosted by EcoAdapt. This webinar is the online convening of an adaptation community between the biennial National Adaptation Forum events. But the next forum is coming up in less than 2 weeks in the Twin Cities of Minnesota from the 9th through the 11th of May. I hope to see all of you there. In the meantime, visit the National Adaptation Forum website, nationaladaptationforum.org, to learn more about attending the event and to view the program to see what kinds of content lie in store. You'll also be able to eventually hear a recording of this webinar. Today's webinar, 100 Days of the New Administration, presents updates on the effects of an election that changed the federal administration's approach to climate change, including climate change adaptation, and from a regional election that changed the local approach to climate change adaptation, although a little bit longer than 100 days ago. And we realize we're jumping the gun on the 100 days a bit, but with the forum coming up in 2 weeks, this was the only day that works for everyone. This webinar, like all National Adaptation Forum webinars, as I mentioned, is being recorded and will be archived on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, cakex.org, your online adaptation destination. By registering for this webinar, you've automatically set yourself up to receive an update when that recording is posted so that you can listen to it again or share it with others. Next slide, please. We're pleased to bring you a great panel today. It stretches that bridge between exploring the challenges and considering hopeful new paths forward. We're very pleased to have the following panelists join us today. Jessica Grannis of the Georgetown Climate Center, Jessica Wentz of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University, plus Dave Pine and Matt Gerhart with the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. I'm your host, Lara, Hansen, Chief Scientist and Executive Director of EcoAdapt, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. This is an interactive webinar, so please, if you have any questions for the panel, post them in either the questions or the chat section of the GoTo interface. And while we'll begin the webinar with presentations from each of the panelists, because they have a lot of information to share with you to get the conversation going, we'll get to your questions in the second half. My interest in today's webinar began because I really wanted to explore how the framework in which we're all approaching adaptation is being changed. Over the past 8 years, a lot happened at the federal level that was providing guidance to move things forward. And I'm hoping that by understanding what the changes are that are happening, we can begin to actually adapt adaptation to continue to make progress in creating climate-savvy societies and resilient natural systems. Since there's no time to waste in addressing climate change, let's begin. Our first panelist is Jessica Grannis, like I said, of the Georgetown Climate Center. Jessica, can you share a bit on the changes to federal adaptation policy that you've been monitoring?
Yes, happy to. Thanks, Laura. So hi all, my name is Jessica Grannis. I'm the Adaptation Program Manager for the Georgetown Climate Center, and I'm just going to give you a high-level overview of what we're seeing in this first 100 plus or minus days and what that means for adaptation. And then Jessica Wentz is going to dig in a little bit more in detail on some of these actions. So for some of you who are unfamiliar with the center, we were created in 2009 to be a resource for the states on climate policy. We help states and local governments on both mitigation, reducing the emissions that cause climate change, and also on adaptation, helping communities prepare for the impacts of climate change. And part of our role is to help states and local government partners navigate these changes in federal policy like we're seeing with the new administration. So first, to understand the actions of the Trump administration, you have to go back in time and understand the history of how the Obama administration started to tackle climate adaptation. And the first big action they took in 2009 was to really get the federal house in order and require that federal agencies consider how climate change will affect their agency operations and missions in sustainability plans. And he did that through Executive Order 13514, which was later updated in 2015. The next thing he did was really to shift the focus in 2013 to looking at how federal agencies could be better partners to their state and local government entities that are really on the front lines of preparing for the impacts. And he did this by launching the Climate Action Plan on one of the hottest days in the year, shown here in June 2013 at Georgetown University. This launched a new focus on looking at local and state actors, and he formalized some of the principles from the Climate Action Plan in a November 2013 Executive Order 13653. Some of the things that flowed from these 2013 actions was a state and local tribal leaders task force, which released its report to the president in 2014, and this also led to the launch of the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit in 2014. Then in 2015, President Obama updated a 1977 executive order on floodplain management, calling for a new federal flood risk management standard to ensure that projects built with federal dollars are sited and designed to be resilient to future flood impacts, including accounting for future sea level rise. And then finally, in 2016, the White House Council on Environmental Quality updated guidance to federal agencies on how to consider climate change in environmental review documents required under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and Jess W. is going to talk about that in more detail. There were other important milestones under the Obama administration, but the ones highlighted here in green are the ones that were specifically targeted in a recent executive order by President Trump. And so to understand the implications of that, we need to dig in a little bit more to see what was actually done through these executive actions. So starting with the Obama Climate Action Plan, the president released a plan in June 2013. And the plan called on federal agencies to modernize their programs and policies to better support state and local efforts to prepare for the impacts of climate change. And it called on agencies to provide targeted assistance to help states and local governments do this important work. It precipitated the creation of a state, local, tribal leaders task force and the development of a climate data initiative and the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. Then later in November of 2013, President Obama formalized some of the recommendations from the plan through Executive Order 13653. And this had two main provisions. One, Section 6, creating an interagency council on climate preparedness and resilience to coordinate adaptation efforts across 30 different federal agencies, and formalizing, which was before that, a task force on adaptation among federal agencies. And then Section 5 of this executive order also called on federal agencies to update agency adaptation plans, and specifically to consider coordination of adaptation efforts across federal agencies and between levels of government, so with their state and local partners in mind. The executive order also explicitly created the state, local, and tribal leaders task force on climate preparedness and resilience, which convened 26 governors, mayors, county officials, and tribal leaders from across the country. And this group was tasked with making recommendations to the president and the federal government on how agencies could better support state and local efforts to prepare for the impacts of climate change. And this map shows you all of the state, local, and tribal government representatives that participated in the task force, and you'll see that it included a good cross-section of representatives from both red states and blue states. So in November 2014, the task force put out over 100 recommendations to the president on how federal programs and policies could be improved. And after the release of this report, many federal agencies took these recommendations to heart and began to adopt changes in agency policy and regulations to implement these recommendations. And some examples include the Economic Development Administration put out guidelines on considering long-term resilience in comprehensive economic development plans, and FEMA updated guidance requiring states to consider climate change in hazard mitigation plans. EPA created a green infrastructure collaborative to help communities deploy green infrastructure approaches to manage stormwater, and FEMA updated policies promoting the use of hazard mitigation funds for green infrastructure projects that reduce flood risks. NOAA created a regional coastal resilience grant program, and the Corporation for National Service created a Resilience AmeriCorps that placed volunteers in communities across the country to assist with adaptation planning, among a ton of other initiatives. So now, fast forwarding to the present day, last month, President Trump signed an executive order on promoting energy independence and economic growth, and the order explicitly rescinded both President Obama's Climate Action Plan and Executive Order 13653. It also, in Section 3D, called on agencies to essentially unwind all of those policies that were put in place as a result of those Obama-era executive actions. So all of those things that we talked about in previous slides. It also rescinded the CQ NEPA guidance, and Just W is going to get into the implications of that. In addition to the executive order unwinding some of these Obama-era actions, the Trump administration has also proposed a budget blueprint for fiscal year 2018, the so-called skinny budget. And this includes significant cuts to programs that state and local governments rely on to do adaptation work. And some examples here include NOAA Sea Grant and other programs that support coastal research and management, climate science, and data collection, including cuts to NOAA's satellite program, HUD funding for the Community Development Block Grant and Choice Neighborhoods program, which is intended to help promote economic development in low and moderate income communities. Discretionary funding for improvements to transit systems and highways like the FTA New Starts program and DOT's Tiger Grant program. Also targeted for cuts were FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation program and discretionary funding for flood hazard mapping, and all EPA's climate change research and partnership programs. It's important to note, however, that this is just a budget proposal and that Congress ultimately has the power of the purse. So Congress would have to act on these recommendations and actually pass a budget that includes these significant cuts to these programs, some of which are incredibly popular among state and local officials and are relied on by folks in both the public and private sector to help them understand how to manage their risks. So what does this all mean for adaptation? What's at risk? Because of Section 3D of the executive order, all of these policies and programs that flowed from the Obama-era actions could be at risk. This includes climate science, data, and tools like the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit and data.gov. It's important to note, however, that those, as we speak, those sites are still online and remain functional. But those came as a direct result of both the executive order and the climate action plan. Proposed budget cuts to NOAA, NASA, FEMA, EPA, and other agencies will also affect the ability of these agencies to continue to provide important climate data, tools, monitoring, technical support, those kinds of resources. Funding is also at risk. Many of the funding programs that cities and states have relied on historically to support climate adaptation planning and projects are on the chopping block. Critically, NOAA funds since the early years of adaptation have been critical to supporting adaptation planning in coastal states. Hazard mitigation funds are used to address flood risks in many states, and so that would have a significant impact on ability of state and local governments to plan. Policy changes that flowed from the Climate Action Plan and Executive Order, and even those that were called for by the State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force are also at risk. So this puts at risk many of the policies and regulations that FEMA, HUD, EDA, and others have put in motion to require consideration of climate change in state and local plans that drive investment decisions and disaster recovery decisions. Finally, interagency coordination is important and also at risk because the executive order called for the creation of the Interagency Council, which has supported coordination across the federal family to improve the delivery of programs and services. Some notable policies that weren't put on the chopping block were the federal flood risk management standards, which weren't rolled back by this executive order, and so that will continue to be implemented for now. And the Trump executive order also left intact requirements for federal adaptation planning, so it's unclear whether or not federal agencies will continue to consider climate in their adaptation plans. So what does this mean for states and communities? Cities and states across the country are already experiencing the impacts of climate change, and this slide shows some of the recent natural disasters that will be exacerbated by climate change that have ravaged our communities. The Rim Fire in California, Sandy flooding in the East Village of New York City, the biblical flood event in Boulder, Colorado, and other cities in Colorado, an extreme heat wave event in Chicago, and the California drought. State and local governments are on the front lines of these impacts, and they're already seeing more frequent and intense extreme weather events that are already affecting people's lives and homes. Yet with this EO and the proposed budget cuts, the administration is preventing federal agencies from helping communities and states prepare for these impacts and hindering the ability of federal agencies to be good partners and prepare their own federal lands, policies, and programs for these effects. The Georgetown Climate Center has some resources to help local governments and states continue to access the tools and plans that were developed under the Obama administration. And so you can quickly and easily find those. We've created a federal adaptation resources portal on our Adaptation Clearinghouse, which you can get to on the Networks tab, where we've preserved and archived all of the resources that were developed by the Obama administration. They're organized by agency on this tab on the left. If you want to find some of the executive orders and plans that I talked about today, you can click on the White House tab, and those will all continue to live here. They've been archived and preserved. And you can also use our detailed filters to find specific resources by resource type. So if you wanted to find all of the executive orders, you could click on executive orders and find those all here. So that's all I had to present today, and I look forward to hearing folks' questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. We're going to have saved questions for the end, but I remind everyone, please start queuing up your questions in the questions and chat section of GoToMeeting. But now we're going to move on to our second panelist, Jessica Wentz of Columbia University. And Jessica, can you share a bit of the changes in federal adaptation policy that you've been monitoring?
Yeah, so I'll be picking up where Jessica Grannis left off and discussing how some specific federal adaptation planning activities may be affected by the executive order on energy independence. Next slide, please. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about how the executive order may affect the extent to which federal agencies are accounting for climate change impacts and adaptation needs in the context of federal environmental reviews conducted under NEPA, natural resource management plans, state hazard mitigation planning, federal flood risk planning, and federal highway projects. Next slide, please. So turning first to NEPA reviews, as Jessica mentioned, the executive order expressly revoked guidance that had been issued by the Council on Environmental Quality in August of 2016. And that guidance, in addition to directing agencies to account for greenhouse gas emissions in their NEPA reviews, also said that agencies should consider the effects of climate change on the proposed action and its environmental impacts. And the guidance explained that this made sense because climate change can make the environment more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. It can alter the nature or timing or magnitude or probability of the proposed action's environmental effects. In addition, things like sea level rise and storms and flooding can cause repetitive damage to infrastructure, which creates this recurring need for repairs and reconstruction. And so this is also an impact that CEQ said that agencies should account for when deciding how to proceed with projects and whether to proceed with projects, especially coastal infrastructure projects. And then finally, climate change can affect the efficacy of mitigation measures in some contexts. And so that's something to think about when agencies are considering how to mitigate the adverse environmental consequences of their projects. Next slide, please. So one key point I want to make about the CEQ guidance is that it did not create new legal requirements, and CEQ was very explicit about that when issuing the guidance. It was intended to summarize and clarify existing requirements that flow from the NEPA statute, the implementing regulations, and the case law. And so I just wanted to provide some citations to the audience to the cases that do support CEQ's interpretation that agencies should account for climate change impacts. And on this slide, I've included cases that don't specifically deal with climate change, but rather these cases support a more general proposition that agencies should be considering the future state of the environment over the lifetime of the project when they're conducting NEPA reviews. Next slide, please. And then there are several cases that have arisen so far in the federal NEPA context that do specifically deal with federal agencies' obligations to account for climate change. And there's sort of two messages you can pull from these cases. The first is that it does indeed make sense for agencies to be considering the effects of climate change, and they should be considering those effects if there are implications for the environmental consequences of the action. But at the same time, courts have been pretty deferential so far, at least in these handful of cases, to agencies' conclusions about whether climate change really does have implications for the environmental outcomes of the project and what the sort of scope and depth of the analysis should be when it comes to looking at the effects of climate change. Next slide, please. So I just want to wrap up the discussion of NEPA by highlighting some examples of projects where a climate change impact assessment would make sense. And keep in mind that this would be true not just in the context of federal environmental reviews, but also state and local environmental reviews as well. So the first category of actions would be facilities where harmful substances are either produced or stored on site, such as wastewater treatment plants and hazardous waste sites, where these facilities are located in areas that are vulnerable to the effects of climate change, primarily flooding and sea level rise. Because if the flood risk in the area or the risk of seawater inundation increases, then that also increases the risk that those hazardous substances will make it out into the ambient environment. And so that's something that should be considered in the environmental review so that the agency can think about what sorts of measures might be warranted in order to reduce that risk of the hazardous substances getting out. Next slide, please. The second category of projects I want to highlight is water supply and management projects. And it makes sense to account for climate change in this context because changes in precipitation and temperature are going to affect hydrology. And this has implications for the environmental outcomes of, for example, a water supply project that establishes water allocation. In recognizing this, the Federal Bureau of Reclamation has already started incorporating pretty detailed predictions of future precipitation and temperature changes into the hydraulic models that it uses to assess the impacts of water management projects. And I just note that because I think that even with the CEQ guidance being rescinded, it may be difficult for the Bureau to justify changing course now that it's established that this type of analysis is both feasible and useful for long-term planning activities, especially for these water supply projects out in the more arid regions of the Western United States, where we may see an increase in droughts and a decrease in surface water availability in the coming decades. Next slide, please. And then finally, it would make a lot of sense to account for climate change impacts when conducting reviews for natural resource management plans, particularly where those plans establish sustainable yields for resources that may be affected by climate change, such as fisheries and rangelands. Climate change can affect the carrying capacity of something like a rangeland, and so if you continue to permit the same amount of grazing even as the landscape deteriorates, then that can generate new and adverse environmental impacts. Next slide, please. So moving on, I want to talk very quickly about some federal actions that are not explicitly addressed in the Energy Independence Executive Order, but that may be affected by this broad mandate to suspend, revise, or rescind actions that are related to or arising from the executive actions from the Obama administration that were revoked. Next slide, please. So first, I already mentioned that climate change impacts should be considered in environmental reviews for natural resource management plans. But of course, climate change and adaptation strategies should also be considered in other types of planning documents. And federal agencies sort of recognizing both the pragmatic need to address climate change impacts as well as Obama's executive orders and underlying policies on climate change adaptation, have indeed begun to do this, and they've published a variety of adaptation plans, guidance documents, scorecards, all kinds of resources to help them and other land managers prepare for the effects of climate change on the resources and landscapes that they manage. And one question is whether they might be rescinding some of these adaptation plans and related documents in light of the Energy and Independence Executive Order. Next slide, please. And I do think it is quite possible that these agencies will be revoking or possibly amending their adaptation plans, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they can just ignore the impacts of climate change when they are preparing natural resource management plans and establishing reasonable uses of natural resources. And that's because most of these agencies are subject to statutory mandates to manage resources in a sustainable fashion and to conduct long-term planning aimed at achieving this goal. And the reality is that climate change can affect the sustainable yield of resources and therefore just by way of background, states have to have a federally approved hazard mitigation plan in place in order to be eligible for FEMA disaster mitigation funding. And back in 2015, responding to Obama's plan and executive order, FEMA revised the state hazard mitigation plan guidance to expressly require states to consider climate change impacts in their plans. And the revised guidance only went into effect a year ago, so most states haven't yet updated their plans to implement it. And it's not clear what the fate of this guidance document will be. It's possible that the references to climate change will be removed due to Trump's sort of policy on climate change and adaptation, but it's unclear. It wasn't expressly targeted in the executive order, so it's just something to keep an eye on. Next slide, please. Another thing to keep an eye on is the federal flood risk management standard that Jessica also mentioned. And this was established in Executive Order 13690. This is a standard that applies to federal actions, but that includes federal grants used to repair and reconstruct after disaster. So it actually has pretty widespread applicability. And it directs agencies to account for future flood risk and the effects of climate change, as well as present flood risk. And it used to be that agencies were just looking at present flood risk when figuring out how to manage that risk. And so FEMA introduced some draft guidelines for implementing the standard in 2015. Those guidelines haven't been finalized yet, and it's unclear what's going to happen with this going forward as well. And this is another thing. It wasn't expressly revoked in the Energy Independence Executive Order, and surely the Trump administration must have known that this executive order existed. So the fact that it wasn't revoked may be a sign that they are not planning to attack this particular piece of the Obama administration's adaptation planning activities. Next slide, please. So finally, I want to briefly note that the Federal Highway Administration has done a lot of work aimed at ensuring climate change risks and resilience are accounted for in federal highway planning activities. And since I'm running short on time here, I'll simply note that the policies and guidance issued by the Federal Highway Administration, which I've linked to on this slide, could indeed be revoked, again, as a result of the executive order, but still the fate is unclear. So it's just another thing to keep an eye on as we move forward. Next slide, please. So that's it for my presentation. I want to thank everybody. I look forward to your questions. And I also just want to direct you to a resource we have on our website called the Climate Deregulation Tracker. We're monitoring both efforts to roll back both mitigation and adaptation actions from the Obama administration. And we monitor both executive actions as well as congressional actions aimed at rolling back the climate change mitigation and adaptation activities. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. I wanted to, again, remind everyone, please put your questions in the question section on the chat so we can get to them in the proper order. And additionally, I wanted to add to that overview that Jessica Wentz just provided, where she was talking about the natural resource management. because it reminded me of another issue that we didn't cover by explicitly focusing in this webinar on the legal side and what the potential rollbacks were. But there's also a component piece that's been going on at the federal level in removing a lot of the science advisory capacity that used to exist to support, in particular, climate actions. Because of last week's climate march, it seems like an appropriate moment to bring that aspect of this up, and that it's not only removal, but it's sort of failure to create. And as part of that, several of the advisory committees that were created under the Obama administration to guide these processes with outside scientific expertise seem to also be disappearing. So another piece of the puzzle in how we maintain momentum in moving adaptation forward, which brings us to our final panelists who may be giving a tag team presentation. Matt Gerhart and Dave Pine are going to discuss a successful local ballot measure that created support for climate-savvy wetland restoration. Matt, can you start us off on an adaptation success story?
Yeah, thanks so much. And I have Dave here. We'll switch off partway through. So thanks, everyone. It's great to talk with you all, and we're here to kind of highlight sort of what are regions and localities doing to sort of forge their own path in climate adaptation. I think in contrast to some of the federal developments, we're seeing some positive things going on in the Bay Area. So we'll get into a little bit about what's happening specific to wetlands ecosystem restoration. But it's very much in the context of how will a major urban region in the United States adapt to sea level rise? How will it potentially use natural systems to do that? So if you can go ahead with the next slide. Just a little background and context. The history of the Bay Area includes a major reduction in the region that used to be wetlands. So back in the 1850s, you'll see on the left that there were large expanses of wetlands throughout the region. These were majorly diked, drained, mostly filled for urban development and agriculture. So by the time you got to the 2000s, there had been a almost 90% reduction in most of these wetland types throughout the region. In particular, areas like the far south San Francisco Bay had become places for industrial salt production, and a lot of agriculture in the North Bay, and then the sort of major urban area that was springing up throughout the late 1950s to 2000s to have 7 million people living here. Next slide. So what has been happening, though, there has been a renaissance in wetlands restoration since about the mid-1990s, and so far, 13,000 acres are in the process of, they've been opened up to be restored, but we have almost 30,000 plus more that we're working on. And the question of funding this in the long term has been a major question for the region. It's clearly a major question moving forward. The majority of the work that had been done to date had been state and federal funded. Next slide. So a group of folks, Dave will get into more of the details of what, how the politics of this came together, but a group of folks wanted to create a local regional authority that could do this work and could raise funding locally to match and leverage federal and state dollars. It was actually created in 2008, so quite a while ago, on the basis of this need that had been identified in a number of scientific documents and was working through a wide range of activities. It has a local governing board made up of electeds from across the whole region and a community-based advisory committee that it uses to guide its decision making. And you'll see it wasn't until June 2016 that the authority was able to put this measure that we're going to discuss on the ballot. So there was a long period of sort of assessing how does one do this, and a couple aspects of that include not just how do you raise local funds for wetland and habitat restoration, but how would you stitch together an entire urban region? This before had never happened in terms of creating a 9-county regional measure. Next slide. So the measure that was put together is a $12 parcel per year tax. It is for the entirety of the Bay region, not just the places that are near the shoreline. And it has passed. It will generate around $500 million over 20 years. It passed with very strong support, remarkably strong support, in fact, and we'll get into some of the how and the why on that. But it's not enough, and it's clearly it's sort of our piece of the puzzle is the way it's viewed. So it's essentially around a third to a quarter of what we do need to do this level of work. And so the context to how other dollars will flow into the region is really important. We have seen that where you have money to spend, that helps you raise other money. And so that was the hope and is the hope with Measure AA. Next slide. And so just a really quick overview of how the program activities were framed for the measure. You'll see that two things that aren't on here are in some ways environmentalism and in another way climate change. So how do you convince a region of millions of people to vote for something like this? And improving water quality, reducing pollution levels, restoring not just the wetlands, but providing for fish and wildlife, and healthy waterways were sort of the messages that were really resonating with folks. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave, and if you can go to the next slide, he'll pick up on sort of the details of the campaigning and how the measure did.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So my name's Dave Pine. I serve on the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors and also have the privilege to chair the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. So I wanted to just talk briefly about how the campaign came together and what we learned. So first off, we had a lot of discussion prior to the campaign about the kind of regional versus local benefits. You know, typically, and oftentimes with funding measures, you know, the traditional thinking is, well, you know, you need to allocate money to everyone and be very specific about where it's going to go so everyone feels they know exactly what they're going to get. We had a little different situation here with this parcel tax and kind of took a hybrid approach where we decided that 50% of the funds would be allocated by population as shown here on the slide, but the other 50% would really go to the highest and best use. So we can go to the next slide now. As Matt mentioned, we could not have been more excited about the outcome. In California, with local revenue measures, typically you require a 2/3 supermajority to pass a measure. And, you know, that is a hard threshold to get 2 out of 3 people to vote for a tax. And oftentimes they fail by a few percentage points. As you get close to that threshold, it gets harder and harder. So we managed to move through the 66.6 all the way to 70.3. That is an aggregate number in the 9 counties. Some of the counties did fall below the 66%, although each of the 9 was in excess of 50%. So, you know, it certainly exceeded my expectations about, you know, I thought it might be a closer vote than it was. So we really had a big victory. And I'll walk you through some of the factors that contributed to that. Go ahead to the next slide. You know, first off, you know, in politics and I guess in life, right, timing is everything. So this slide shows the extensive polling we did over the years, going all the way back to 2010. And we found that the support for the measure correlated very much with the state of the economy. So as the economy strengthened, our support for our measure strengthened. So that was certainly a big deal for us. Also, we spent a lot of time deciding whether to go to the voters in June of 2016 or November of 2016. And, you know, traditional wisdom is that the November presidential elections are the best time for a tax measure because the voter turnout is so high and tends to be more favorable towards new taxes. But we took a different strategy here again in that we chose June, and that worked out very well for us. And the benefits of June were that the ballot wasn't very crowded. When we get to November in California, there were dozens of measures on the ballot. So it made it a lot easier for us to communicate to voters when they didn't have as much on their mind in June. And then secondly, we had a benefit from the fact that the Bernie Sanders Clinton campaign was still running strong, and there was a lot of support for Sanders here in the Bay Area. So, going out to the voters at a time of economic prosperity in our region, plus during an election where the turnout was decent, generally progressive, and the ballot wasn't crowded. Next slide, please. Now, going back to the point I made earlier about broad benefits, regional benefits versus local benefits, while we did not promise funding for any particular project, we did our best to communicate to voters that there were projects all around the Bay that could benefit from this measure. So we put together this map that you see, again, to give voters a flavor for that. And, a couple of things that came out of the polling, which were really powerful, was that, voters, for the most part, really looked at the Bay as a region, and we're very, very focused on passing the Bay on to the next generation in a better condition than it is now. And as Matt said also, the ecosystem benefits were tremendously important to voters in the polling that we did. In fact, the number one highest ranking polling item was fish and the health of fish. So what didn't poll as well was the benefits, the natural benefits of tidal wetland restoration for climate protection and as defenses against sea level rise. People like that benefit, but the ecosystem benefits were a stronger motivator. However, the second message of the benefits of wetlands to sea level rise protection was a really important one when we went out to do fundraising, because we did have to raise about $3 million to mount this campaign. And much of it came from the business community, which is much more focused on the flood protection and the risk to sea level rise in the Bay Area. So we really had two messages, somewhat for different audiences. We can go to the next and final slide. So a couple of lessons, and Matt, please chime in too, is connecting climate change to pressing needs and core values. Certainly in our region, a fundamental core value is the health of the San Francisco Bay. It's the defining feature of our region. As Matt pointed out, we're thrilled to have $500 million to work with over 20 years, but our needs are much greater. For example, many of our projects we anticipate and remain hopeful that we'll secure Army Corps funding, which typically requires a local match. A challenge for us going forward is getting these projects done in an expeditious way. They really show the voters who favored the measure, what they're getting for their money. So, a challenge that we face, I'm sure, is common around the country, is that the permitting for these projects can be very, very, very arduous. So we're having a lot of discussions here regionally to see what we can do to expedite that. And then finally, we do have challenges that we will not be able to solve with natural infrastructure solutions alone. Measure AA allows us to build levees only in connection with tidal wetland restoration. So to the extent that we need to do, really a gray solution, say like around our airports, Measure AA would not raise funds for that. So we have an incredibly diverse shoreline and somewhat limited opportunities to do wetland restoration. So this is, not obviously a solution for the complete sea level rise challenge that we face, but an incredibly helpful one. And, we could be more excited about having the opportunity to, bring these dual ecosystem benefits and flood protection benefits to the Bay Area. So thank you.
Thank you, Dave and Matt, for the tag team, and thanks to Jessica and Jessica. We are now moving into the question portion of the program. We've already got a couple questions and comments that have come in. The first was that John Mankowski wanted to point out the line in Jessica Grannis's presentation with the potential budget, the proposed budget cuts, that the 12% in DOI, people need to think about the linkage between that and the DOI's landscape conservation cooperative programs and the climate science centers and the value that they're providing to groups like Dave and Matt's, who are using that science that they provide in the partnerships, because I know that in California, the California LCC, for example, partners on a lot of the Bay Area projects, and what will that mean? But on to a question. Jim Height asks, realistically, how do you think different federal agencies will respond to new CEQ guidance around climate change in NEPA? And how can stakeholders influence agencies to keep climate change on their radar in NEPA impact assessments?
I'll take that one on. I think that, so back when CEQ was developing this guidance on climate change in NEPA, before it had finalized it, there were definitely big discrepancies in terms of how federal agencies accounted for climate change impacts in their EISs, and certainly the Forest Service and the Parks Department and the National Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service were all pretty much doing a pretty good job accounting for the effects of climate change and adaptation options. And I suspect that what we're looking at now is just an absence of guidance. I don't think we're going to see new CEQ guidance soon. And I think that in the absence of guidance, there's a reasonable chance that they'll consider these things. They'll continue to consider these things, even with the overarching policy from the Trump administration. Agencies know that they're going to get sued very often when they prepare environmental impact statements, and so they prepare them with an eye towards avoiding litigation. And I think that they will take that into account as they're doing this. In terms of people getting involved and making sure that they consider climate change impacts, I think commenting on draft environmental impact statements and scoping documents, you'd want to be very specific in terms of pointing out what effects of climate change may impact the project and its surrounding environment, and how that might have implications for the project's environmental outcomes. And the more specific you can be, the more likely the agency will then account for that in the final environmental review document.
Yeah, this is Jess Jeet. I mean, to put a blunter point on it, I mean, it's kind of ironic because the CEQ guidance were really intended to provide some certainty to the agencies who were being sued because they were failing to account for climate change in environmental review documents. And so this basically creates that uncertainty again and enhances the chance that they're just going to get sued because they don't have this clarity of what is required and what's not required. So, you know, these guidance were really intended to forestall litigation. So it puts us back to a place of uncertainty where agencies are now going to have to figure out how to hedge their bets so that people don't sue them. So it's kind of unfortunate.
Thank you. Okay, the next question, I'd love to get thoughts from both the top down and the bottom up. So all the panelists, this is open to you. This is from Lisa Horrocks. There's a lot of bad news and uncertainty. Clearly, she wrote that before she heard the hopeful final presentation. But are there any glimmers of hope for how climate resilience and adaptation might be supported under, say, increased infrastructure investment in the new administration? And when we get to the second part of the answer from Matt and Dave, one of the things you guys brought up was the potential role of Measure AA in providing those important matching funds that are needed to often get access to those federal infrastructure dollars. So I think the movement on the infrastructure investment. Oh, go ahead.
Sure, this is Jessica G. I mean, what we're hearing is that the infrastructure package is more going to be focused on financing and tax incentives and less on real dollars that are going to flow down to cities and states. And I think, you know, cities and states have struggled to figure out how to finance resilience in terms of infrastructure. There is more being done and best practices that are coming out. But I think, it's still TBD on what an infrastructure package will look like and how much of it will actually be real dollars that flow to allow communities to do, resilient infrastructure projects versus, greenfield projects or financing mechanisms like tax credits that would make it difficult to figure out how to leverage that for resilient infrastructure projects.
And this is Jessica W. I'll just chime in and say another consideration here is that not all infrastructure promotes adaptation objectives. So a lot of infrastructure can be adaptive, like the bridges that we continuously rebuild at the same height and to the same specs even after a storm washes them away. And so without sort of guidance about how any funding or financial assistance is spent, and there's no guarantee that it will help with climate change adaptation.
Yeah, and on the flip of that, this is Matt. I was just going to say on the flip side of that, I think federal inaction doesn't prevent a lot of local and regional action. And as Dave mentioned, a lot of the constraints that a region like ours has involve major infrastructure, including, airports, ports, railways, and in particular highways. And a lot of those organizations within the state, at least, are paying attention. So the more that we mainstream, and I think there is some success in mainstreaming climate considerations into infrastructure planning, then sort of whatever the dollars are that come down, the right projects are getting built. And so that's been a lot of the focus within our state, and that's certainly a focus of the region as a whole.
So that brings us to another question that we've actually gotten from a couple of people, including Josh Foster's version of it, which is, what are prospects that state and local government will step up and advance or enhance climate change legislation, particularly on adaptation, to fill the federal vacuum? And if anyone has any thoughts on a second piece of this, is there a way that individual state actors, like, say, California, where the past two webinars on this topic we've had speakers from California, because quite frankly, a lot is going on there that's fairly unique. Is there a way that actions at one state level can be used to leverage broader action across either a regional geography or similarly inclined states, or disinclined states, even more importantly?
Well, I'll hop in again, and I think Dave can add some examples. I do think, there's this idea that California can lead and others will follow. And in some cases, that's because of the economic power of the state. So a standard that gets set can effectively push producers and manufacturers and business into that space. I also think that we are doing a lot to just collaborate, at state levels. So where people can learn from each other, and that includes people, working with Florida, people working on the East Coast, people working up in Alaska. There's information transfer happening that way. And I think if you take it to the region, I think we have some leadership coming out of the counties.
The Bay Area, we're kind of leading the resistance here in many ways. And we have an aggressive agenda at the local level to continue to make progress on climate adaptation and climate mitigation. For example, on the mitigation side, there's a big movement here in the Bay Area and actually across the state to continue to green the grid through a program called Community Choice Aggregation or Community Choice Energy, which we've adopted in our county. And today we have 50% of our electric power from renewable sources, and that's picking up momentum across the state. And then on the adaptation side, a number of the counties are, putting in place adaptation plans, really undeterred by what's happening on the federal level. But the lack of federal funding is going to be a challenge any way you look at it.
Yeah. So this is Jess G. I think I wouldn't give up the store just yet. I think that, with the budget cuts in particular, there was a lot of pushback to the budget blueprint, and I do think that state and local voices and private sector voices will matter on the Hill if we do have a budget and there are like significant cuts on the table for things like climate science and data and technical support and these programs that really support core functions at the state and local level, and things like emergency managers that respond to these disasters when they hit. So I would say, first and foremost, before we say, okay, how are we going to fill the gap, but having that as a plan B is great, but thinking about how do we preempt that in the first place is even more important. So, collect your stories. How would those budget cuts affect your local budgets and the work that you do to protect people's health, safety, and welfare, to promote jobs, to, spur your local economy. And so I think that's going to be really important to sway Congress to know that these programs really matter. And I think there are certain pieces of the puzzle that, we can't fill at a local level in a piecemeal way, unless Jerry Brown is literally going to launch satellites. Like, there are pieces of the puzzle that the federal government plays that are critical to helping us understand the climate system and knowing what our risks are. And so, really making sure that we're messaging that and making sure that we're advocating for those dollars to stay in play is going to be really important. And I think a good example of where we've seen a win on that front is with the federal flood risk management standards that Jessica W. was talking about more in depth. Those were in original drafts of the executive order that Trump was supposed to sign that came out. That was on the chopping block, as well as the other things that we did talk about. But there's a lot of advocacy from Q and the Association of State Floodplain Managers, Smarter, Safer, R Street. A bunch of groups came together and said that this shouldn't be cut out and that we need to keep this, that this made sense. And so it did come out of that executive order ultimately. I mean, I think it's still being considered, but, it shows that there is ability to persuade this administration. And so, thinking about who that coalition of partners is going to be to get those messages through is going to be really, really important.
Also, I see a glimmer of hope in this emerging climate caucus in Washington, which I believe is about 30 members now. And the way it's set up is they bring in one Democrat and one Republican each time they add to the caucus. So, to my mind, to have, 15 Republicans in a climate caucus is actually real progress. That's a very, very encouraging trend in my mind.
One last question that goes back to a point that Jessica Grannis just brought up about whether or not California will launch satellites. How has Silicon Valley business leadership been involved around San Francisco Bay? And did they do more than provide some of the $3 million mentioned?
Well, the business involvement was absolutely critical to passing Measure AA, and the business community remains engaged. One question that comes up or is asked from time to time is, do we foresee the major companies actually contributing real dollars to some of these adaptation projects? That is something we remain hopeful about. There's a project down in the South Bay where Facebook has made a contribution towards the planning of the project. Most of these companies do directly abut the bay, so they do have real significant exposure to their facilities. So we're keeping them in the dialogue and are hopeful that their support financially will become more apparent.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. Thanks to our great panelists for bringing us up to speed on the challenges and the opportunities for moving adaptation forward. And thanks to you, the listeners, for joining us today. Please feel free to point your colleagues who could not attend today's broadcast to the recorded version once you receive the link. And in addition to the webinar recordings, the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, kcx.org, is home to hundreds of adaptation resources, including federal resources that are vulnerable to changing federal priorities, just like Jessica Grannis pointed out on the Georgetown site, as well as case studies about efforts like that described by Matt and Dave in the San Francisco Bay Area. So when you go to share the recording of today's webinar, check out everything else at kicx.org. We have several webinars developing for later in 2017, so stay tuned. Until that next webinar, be sure to join us at the National Adaptation Forum in 2 weeks, and we'll see you in St. Paul. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.